G'day Bifrosters, here's some very bright flickery neon. So I'm going to show you how to put one of these together today. They're quite popular. It's flickering because I rendered it as a play blast through the Arnold viewport. And really it is fields, particles and trails, and the trails are just strands rendered in Arnold. So this is a requested tutorial from Dario. Very, very happy to do it. Let's get started on it. This is what the tutorial ends up looking like, but that's not where we're starting. We're going to start here. So this one you don't even need to leave Bifrost really. What you need to do is just drop down a plane, mesh plane, and this is going to be your canvas. It's going to be what your particles roll around on, or roll around just above, or whatever it is you want it to do. We're going to use it right now to set up the field. So first thing I want is a fractal turbulence field and a time warp. Plug the time into the time warp, and I just happen to know that you don't want the time to be going very fast on this one. Before we get too much further, let's get a scope down. It's going to be a vector field scope because we are outputting a vector field and of course a terminal. So we can see what we're doing. So let's pop this field out to the terminal. There it is. It's quite a big field right now, so we're going to use this mesh as our probe geometry. And now we can see our field happily evolving, making all kinds of nice patterns. And this is going to be what we drive our particles and our trails with. And this entire exercise is all about making one thing that drives another thing that drives another thing. That's kind of describes all of Bifrost as well, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. I'm going to drop down a curl field. And then, that's not where I wanted it. I swear that Bifrost does this to me on purpose. What I'm doing is I'm driving the curl field with the fractal turbulence field, and then I'm going to drop a cross product in. Cross product multiplies two vectors. That's pretty much all I know. I also know that the result tends to be the vector at right angles to both of the input vectors. How the math works, yeah, I don't know. But let's drop this in, and we can start to see our fields getting a little bit curlier. You're getting more of a swirling motion, which is what the curl field is giving us. And I'm going to use one more cross product, like this. And I'm going to cross product this with a simple vector field. And that vector field is going to be 0, 1, 0, so pointing straight up. And the reason I'm doing this is to lie everything flat on the plane. Yes, hello, pop in there. So now you can see all of the vectors are lying flat on the plane because the vector that's at right angles to both this vector and a vector pointing straight up, an up vector, is flat on the plane. And that's what I want them for. So that's looking pretty good. It's got some nice curls and swirls and things in it. Let's jump into our scope. We'll turn on flow lines so we can see what's going on. We'll make it just a little bit, quite a lot thinner. Maybe not quite that thin. I'm just going to up the divisions of my plane a little bit, just for visual, so I can get a better idea of what my field is actually doing. It's going to slow things down a bit. Quite a bit. Probably actually far too much. So that's half that. I'm sure we'll still get the same idea. It's still a bit slower, but it's giving me the nice loops and whirls that I want to see. I'm going to take my turbulence field, I'm going to make it twice as strong. You can see all the reds turn up. But I'm going to make it less frequent, so you've got much smoother curves. I'm just going to up the frequency a little bit. So we've got quite interesting swirls and walls and, you know, just a bit of a weather pattern going on. And at that point, I'm going to call my field fairly done. Yeah, those are some interesting shapes right there, which is what I was after. But that's where we're at right now. We've built our first driver. What we're going to drive with this is a particle system. So with a particle system, we're just going to throw down a basic particles graph. Let's get these guys out the way, not needed. Explode that, and straight away get rid of the collider, because we're not going to collide any particles here. I'm going to use my plane as my emission geometry. I'm going to take the segments down a bit again so that we've got a bit more of a faster moving thing. And then I'm going to emit a ton of particles on it. Let's start at 250. So this is distributing them randomly on the surface. It's converting the surface to a volume for emission purposes. This is the rate per second, so it should be generating 250 particles per second. And the count just means that number of particles. If I had a volume I was actually emitting from, I could use density or count by point, which would mean 250 particles per point in this object. So let's have a look at this. Now let's actually see our particles, shall we? We've seen that field now. Let's pop the particles into the proxy. Go back to the beginning. I should get some grey dots turning up. This is just showing me the particles. Now right now they're emitting with a speed of 2 there, going straight up off the normal there. I'm going to get rid of those two numbers. So now the particles are just going to fall because gravity is still on. So let's switch off gravity. Put that up there for a sec. Switch off gravity, don't need gravity for this. Yeah, we've just got particles being born, living for 2 seconds and dying. Yeah, that's all they're doing. They're going to get more interesting. First thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to vary that age time, that lifespan. So this is the particle's lifespan. They will all die at 2 or before. I'm going to turn that into a random value. So I can just put down a random value like that. I need to make sure the seed is plugged into something that's changing. So we'll plug it into the timeout, which is great. And then our random value, we're just going to pop straight into our age limit. Let's change that from the minimum age to die at will be, I don't know, 1.5, and the maximum will be 6. So we'll get some that'll live for 6 seconds, some that'll live for 1.5 seconds. So let's get those particles moving with our field. That way we can start to see kind of what our final output's going to look like and whether we're happy with it, whether we have to go back and change the field or whatever we need to do. So to do that, I'm going to get what's called an influence set property. And what this is going to do for me, let's drop those for now, is I'm able to use a value to influence a property on these particles. And the property I want to influence, which goes into the key, is point velocity. Velocity. So what we do is we take our field, we hook it up to the value, so it's providing the value to change. This is what we're changing, and this becomes the influence. So now, what should happen is I start to see particles going around and around the field. So they're following, you can see how they're following the field lines, because the field lines are providing their velocity. Some are going fast, some are going slow. That's exactly what we want. We want to avoid things like this, where they just get lost out in the wild. So before we put our trails on, which is another node that will turn these particles' movement into strands, let's limit the bounds of our simulation. So you can see there's got a simulation bounds here. What I'm going to do, I'll take my original plane, which is around here somewhere. I'm going to drop down one of my bounds nodes. And what that does is it makes a bounding box for me. We can actually have a look at that. There we go. So that grey box, which has 0 thickness right now, because I'm putting a little bit of thickness because I'm putting it on a plane, is the bounds of my simulation. This won't simulate outside of that. So let's take our bounds and we'll turn on symmetric padding. We'll just give it a little bit of padding either side. You can see the rectangle change on screen there, but we'll give quite a bit of padding top and bottom. So this is just, that's possibly a little too much. There we go. So it's basically just drawn a box around our simulation space. You can see that some of these field lines are sticking outside of it, and if I go back to 0 and run the particles now, you can see they die when they hit the box. So before they were going outside with the field, but now when they hit the box, they're just dying. They're disappearing. Great. Don't need to see that anymore. We know it works. You can see it working here. So any particles that go outside those bounds aren't just killed. Let's get some funky trails going on. So there is a node for that, as they say, and it's just called, funnily enough, create particle trails. It's part of the Rebel pack, so you'll need the Rebel pack for this to work. Your particles go in there, and you set up what frame you'd like them to start on. One is pretty good, and how long you would like the trail to be in frames. So let's say we'll start with 32. And I'm actually going to turn my particles off, plug the trails in, and just turn off the field for now. And immediately that explodes. And the reason it explodes is that the particles need to have an ID, and they need to have a unique label for each particle. And it's turned off by default. So to turn that on, you turn on label point ID. This will become important later. But now, straight away, you can see we're starting to get the effect we were after. These are our particle trails. This is what we'll be rendering in Arnold. They're moving all through the field. The field is affecting them. It's affecting the velocity of the particle, which is then drawing a trail. So this is what I was talking about earlier on, where you have a field set up, including the time node. That's these guys here. Let's give them a backdrop. So that's our field. That sets up and works out all of our field, does our cross product. This is our scope just for looking at it, so that doesn't really need to be in there. And then out of the field comes this, which is now driving our particles, which are these guys here, with the bounds included and a random value for the lifespan. Yep, we'll give them a backdrop. And so those are our particles. So far we have a set of fields, or two, three really. We have some fields and they're driving a particle setup. That's all we're doing right now. And then the output of that particle setup is being turned into strands, which is what these guys are. At this point in time, the effect is complete. Everything from here is color and render. So let's do color and render. So here's a GIF version of what it is. And we're aiming for this. So we've got random colors in here. And we've got it rendered in Arnold, at least in the viewport, which is why it's flickering. So we now need to set up a color per strand. Okay, so what we do is we lay down a get strand structure. Try saying that 3 times fast. And we only really want one thing out of that, and that is the point strand index. And this is going to give us an index for each strand. So with this, we can take this and put it into a random value. And into the random value, we need to set up a from and to color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that over to a float 3. And I do this for a reason, so that we don't get messy with alpha channels, basically. And I'm quite happy to go from 0, 0, 0 to 1, 1, 1. Well, maybe we don't want black ones. Let's keep that low. 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, and then 1, 1, 1. What this is essentially going to do is it's going to generate a random color of these between these two values for each strand. So of course, for a color to work, we need to take this and go vector 3 to vector 4, because colors are vector 4. And I did this just so that I never have any alpha channels that aren't solid. And then we can take our strands here from particle trails. We're going to set a geoproperty. And that geoproperty is going to be color. Like this. And let's pop this to an output and see what we get. So once again, we're driving one thing with another. Right now, we're starting to drive strands and colors with the strands. And to throw something into Arnold, let's just go, we need to assign a material, like that. And then that needs to go to an output. This one will do. Now, we come over to our hypershade, like so. And I'm going to make an AI standard surface. It's just Arnold standard surface, but this one I'm going to turn off my base color, turn off my specular color, turn on emission, and make that emission really, really high, 2. And then I need to bring in this attribute to Arnold. So I need to bring in the color attribute. So to do that in Arnold, I can do AI user data, AI user data color, which is what we want. And let's just get our property editor over here. The attribute needs to match. So we'll use color. So this is just saying somewhere in this graph or somewhere coming into Maya, find this attribute, which is called color, and it's going to come in as default black if it can't find it. So let's plug that into the emission color. And we've got a little error over here that something's not having a nice time having its panels moved about, I think. So we'll change that back up there. You can't see that because it's on my other screen. And now we just, let's put this over here so you can see it. We'll drag this in here, drag and drop, middle click, Arnold standards, AI standard surface, plug that into the surface material. All good. Okay, and then go back to the beginning and play it. Now I need to switch my renderer to Arnold. I'm going to get a little IPR renderer here, which I'm going to turn on. Now these strands have come in as great big fat ribbons, which is not, not a terrible thing. They're all very, very bright because I set an emission shader with a buttload of emission. And you can kind of see that this is doing the thing. This is working properly. It's going to render it. It's going to do all kinds of things. So we need to get that looking a bit more like tubes, because the whole idea was to get tubes. So to do that, we need to set up some strand settings for Arnold. So we just go Arnold strand settings. Just here will be fine. I'm just going to change mode override to thick. Let's go back to the beginning and see what that gives us. We need to skinny them up a bit. The way we can do that is, I believe, if we just come back to our particles, which are driving our trails, I think we can just set the particle width in the solver settings. No? In the source particles. Somewhere. Size, 0.1. So let's see what 0.01 looks like. Restart the simulation. There we go. And what I've got these guys doing is they're emitting light. That's what the emission is. So what I'm going to do too, I'm going to make another standard surface and do the same thing again. Except this time I'm going to pull this out of here. This is going to be for my plane. Well, for a plane that I'm going to put in. I'm going to make a very black base that has maybe about half specular with quite a bit of roughness, like this. And we'll just call this plane. Will be just fine. We'll drop that in there for use later. Pop that back over there for now. So I'm just going to grab the plane that I built everything off, which I think is here somewhere, that one. Copy that, paste that down as a new thing. And I'm just going to have another assigned material. Give it its own output. And then grab this plane material that I set up before and then go set that to surface material. It'll go black. And now, as we see this, let this run for a bit and render a little bit. That's interesting. It's halfway through itself, isn't it? So I need to drop that plane down a bit. So let's just go for translate points. We'll be fine. Thinking. We just need one, so not an array of vectors. And then I can just go minus 0.05. So that's just dropped it down a tiny bit. And now you can start to see the reflections come in. So we'll get it to about there and let it render. And you can start to see the light that they're emitting onto the plane there. So I'm going to try a different tack here. I'm going to actually throw in here really saturated colors using a different setup. So I'm still going to keep this kind of thing, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a 3-point ramp. It's a node I made, which is available on my download there. And I'm going to, color 1 is going to be pure red, color 2 is going to be pure green, color 3 is going to be pure blue. My midpoint is going to be 0.5. I'll leave the fall off curve as it is, and I just need to put in some of these like input, an input gradient, which I can use the point strand index for, I think. Let's try it and see. To float. And then we'll pop that in there. And then these, I believe, come out as vector 4s. They do. So we'll just plug that straight into the data here and see what our render does now. There we go. Much more neon. So it's just using really highly saturated colors. It's just reds, greens, and blues at this point in time. I can push that out by just changing what I put into color 1, color 2, and color 3. But you're getting the idea. So there we go. Neon crawlies. Arnold is doing a fantastic job rendering it. Doing this has given me some cool ideas for stuff. This looks a lot like a long exposure of traffic, for example. And so I'm sure I'll be putting a bit more work into this, including doing things like making them even thinner, because once you get a lot of them, they get kind of fat and all together. I make them real thin. Let me just get crazy thin. That's pretty nice. I'll let that render for a bit and see what we get. Get it thickening up a little bit. Yeah, I need to address the colors a bit better, perhaps. I need to work out how to offset them so they're not all like sitting right on top of each other, which I think is probably going to come from the particles, but I can work on that. And I'll need to resample the arrays so you don't get jaggies. But that being said, this is still quite a nice look. You let Arnold render, you can see some of the reflections. If you want those reflections to be a little bit more precise, a little bit nicer, if you're going to do what I'm doing and do it this way, then you just need to translate this up. So don't translate as much. Since these points are super thin now, then you actually get a lot more accurate looking reflections like this. You get that whole 80s neon dream going on, if you like. Changing this ramp will just change up those colors for you. You can make it from dark red to a purple, like this. And you get all sorts of interesting changes you can make in here. All sorts of horribly bright neon colors. And of course, if you wanted them all one color, you could just make them all yellow. Or you could, yeah, so you could just say red, slightly orange, yellow, and smack in the middle. And you get this kind of effect. But yeah, that's about it. So I'll just quickly run through that. Let that run for now for a little bit so we've got something pretty to look at while we do it. That'll do. Kind of like sunbeams or whatever. If you were to get real funky, you could kind of almost do a, like I said, traffic sort of thing. So tail lights and headlights, you could just make double particles or whatever you wanted to do there. Let that render, you get the idea. So what we did is we set up a field system using a turbulence field, a curl field, and two cross products, and basically an up vector. And we got a field that we like the look of. We threw that field out to a vector field scope, which is still there if you wanted to have a look at it. And I'm not sure Arnold will render it, so let's forget about that for now. Let that play for a bit. See, that's what happens. You have to restart the simulation because particles, like solvers, don't know what the next frame brings. It's all dependent on whatever happens on the frame you're doing now. Let's get that to somewhere like 50 where it's kind of cool. Then when we had a field to our satisfaction, we built a really simple particle system that we plugged the field into. So here's our particle system. We just have a random value going into the particle age so that we get different lengths of trails, basically. Or they start and stop at different times is how that affects it. We made a plane. We used the plane, well, we've been using the plane for a while, but we used the plane to make bounds, which stops the particles from going outside that plane. Bounds is a custom node and it's available on my download area and hopefully GitHub soon, if work gives me 5 minutes to do some housekeeping. So what we did is we plugged our field into an influence set property, which set the point velocity of the particles based on the field, and then we just let them simulate. That was our particles finished. So we now have fields driving particles, and the particles are now driving these trails, which is a node that comes from RipplePack. You plug in your particles in the particles. Point position and point size is the default, and that works fine. What frame would you like to start on, and the number of frames you would like to trail. So I can make these trails longer by increasing that number, or shorter. So let's go for shorter by decreasing it. So now you'll get, rather than the great big long trails, they'll just come and go as the particles live and die. And you can see the difference there. So that's all cool. After that, our effect was done. All we did from there was we played around with color a bit. So here's the colors. I ended up using another custom node called Ramp 3, which allows me to change the colors across a ramp, as well as things like a fall-off curve, like that, which of course means I have to play it again, Sam. And that's just affecting how the colors change, or how fast the colors change from the top color to the bottom color. Don't play backwards, stop. From the top color to the bottom color. Plug that into a set geo color, making sure we remembered the name of our property. Then we set up our Arnold strand settings so that they were being rendered as a thick, so basically as a tube rather than a ribbon. I can change that back and you will see ribbons. Very, very thin ribbons, I believe. Because we've set our particle size to tiny. Set particle size to tiny, which we did. We then made a surface that had some emission on it, which is over here, which has these properties on it. No base color, well, black base color, black specular, very, very emissive, and our user data color, which, I shouldn't have shut that, which has our attribute here, color. Now, I mean, I'd name it better if I was doing it professionally, but it has the same attribute name here as you get in Bifrost when you set up the set geo color. So just to, I could change this to point color, and all of a sudden Arnold would have no idea what it's supposed to render. It's all still there. You can select the Bifrost graph, you can see them, but they're just black. It doesn't know what it's supposed to render. So until I go into my hypershade, which is around here somewhere, and I go back to Arnold user data color, change that to point color. Now it renders because it's taking that attribute out and using it to drive, in this case, the base color, the specular color, and the emission color. So that's super handy, and that works for an awful lot of things, and it's literally wonderful. To get all of that to work, you need an assign material. Get rid of that, it's confusing. Which assigns our material to, assigns this material to this graph, and then we output. Down here we just set up a black plane with a different material on it that was quite reflective so that we could get those nice hovering, that hovering neon feeling going on there. And we're done. So yeah, that's really quickly how to set it up. You can get much better results out of different fields, out of putting more resolution into your strands so that they're not so jaggy, and sort of, you can do that by resampling them, but the more points you add to a strand, the slower it's going to be. But it's okay if you're quite happy to wait for beautiful things, then that's cool. And yeah, that's about it. So I hope that's helped, and catch you next time. Thank you very much.